Now I would like to turn it over to Blair Kauffman, my friend, who will be moderating the first panel, which is called The Future of the Library. Blair, in addition to his budding acting role, as you saw in the movie, is the law librarian and a professor of law at Yale Law School. He's an all-around wonderful person. He's a member of the administration of Yale Law School, and he's also a faculty fellow of the Yale Information Society Project. So before I turn it over to Blair, I would just like to thank you one more time for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy this symposium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura, and thank all of my friends and colleagues in the Information Society Project for pulling this conference together, and thank all of you for coming. My job as moderator is to keep everybody on time. That's my primary job, and so we're going to limit each speaker to 12 minutes. We'll have 2 panels of speakers, 12 minutes each, and then we'll break so we can have a conversation with you, and then we're going to have 2 more speakers and a break with more conversation with you. 12 minutes may seem like a short period of time, but actually it's so much longer than 140 characters, and these guys are used to doing 140 characters, so 12 minutes is like doing a huge paper. So I'm going to try to keep my own remarks very, very short too, just a few tweets worth. So let me tell you what we think Library 2.0 is. It can mean different things to different people. If Library 2.0 is corresponds to Web 2.0, we really think about social networking and how social networking technologies might be used in a library context. And as you saw in that video, we're thinking of all sorts of innovative ways that we can employ social networking in a library setting. So we use it in our information discovery tools. That used to be our online catalog, which used to be our print card catalogs. So our information discovery tool allows users to rank information resources, to review information resources, to add tags to information resources, and make the information discovery tool more powerful by harnessing the power of the network. We're using the social web technologies to connect with our users in a number of really cool and interesting ways. So we have a presence on Facebook. I hope that those of you on Facebook are all fans of the Yale Law Library. If you're not, sign up and be a fan. Most of our librarians, especially the reference librarians, are on Facebook. A lot of the librarians tweet. We're Amiibo, and a host of other technologies are being used to connect to users. And we're thinking about how Web 2.0 technologies can be used to generate user content by using wiki technologies and so on. So there's that. But actually, we're thinking here of Library 2.0 as something much broader. We're thinking about what is the role of the library in a digital world. If a library's traditional role is to collect, preserve, and make available information resources, what does that mean when we move from a print environment to a largely digital environment? When instead of purchasing materials, we're licensing materials. What does that mean for access to our users? What does that do to the first sale doctrine? What is our responsibility? What should our concerns be about digital rot? We've heard a lot about digital rot lately. What happened? Should we be concerned about national catastrophes like Katrina, like wars? Like, how are we going to preserve for future generations of users our cultural heritage if we're in this digital world? And what is the library's responsibility in the preservation context? Do we have a responsibility to preserve our web pages? Do we have a responsibility to preserve web pages created in our institution? Do we have a responsibility to preserve web pages created by faculty members? Do we have a responsibility to preserve blogs, library blogs, faculty members' blogs, balkanization? When I first met Jogn Palfrey, the first thing he asked me was, what is the Yale Law Library doing to preserve the email correspondence for the historical deanship of Harold Coe? I said, wow. So those are just a few of the issues that arise in this Library 2.0 context. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my panel of speakers who will get a little bit more into the various issues. And so the way we're going to proceed is I first have Josh Greenberg, who is the technical internet guru at New York Public Library. And Josh is going to give a general overview of Library 2.0 issues and what, with examples of what's come up in the New York Public Library context. We're then going to move on to my colleague Jogn Palfrey from the Harvard Law Library, who is the author of Born Digital, and he's going to tell us a little bit about what we can expect from this new generation of library users that have grown up in an entirely digital context, and how that might be driving libraries and the kinds of services and information resources that we provide. So then the 12 minutes, my job is to keep them on time. I'm just going to pull them down after 12 minutes. And then will allow a question and answer period from you guys. And again, we're going to hold you to time too. You just have about 15 minutes for a question and answer session. But you know, you can do it in 140 characters or less, right, each question. And then we'll go back to the second half of the panel. We've got Ann Wolpert, who is the university librarian at MIT and also is the director of the MIT Press. And from that unique vantage point, she can tell us a little bit about the future of the book and the future of scholarly communication. And lastly, we have my colleague from the Internet Society Project, Charles Cronin. And Charles is going to talk a little bit about how digitization may be changing the landscape for libraries, big and small, how it may or may not be. And that's how we'll close up. We'll have another question and answer period after that. And that's how the program will proceed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Josh.
Okay, is this volume all right? I'm Josh Greenberg. I'm the Director of Digital Strategy and Scholarship at the New York Public Library, where we're really in the thick of this. You're not allowed to leave this spot. Okay, go ahead. So what I wanted to do today was open things up by telling you a story. And it's a story about a librarian named Jessica Pigza. I got to know Jessica shortly after I arrived at the New York Public Library, which was shortly after she arrived as well. She's a reference librarian in the General Reference Division of the New York Public Library, which is on the lofty third floor of the big building with the lions on 42nd Street in New York, which looks like this today. There are librarians behind a desk, and you can go up to them and ask them questions, and they will help you find things. This is very similar to the way things have worked for about 100 years in that building. What's remarkable is, actually, if you notice here, sort of right in the center, there are two brass pneumatic tubes. This is actually how books are requested at the library. You go, you file the form, you put it into this pneumatic tube, it shoots down into the bowels of the stacks, and they pull the books out for you. So there's very much this in-person mediation and this in-person role for librarians in the General Reference Division. So shortly after I got to NYPL, we started talking about how do we get, what's the right role for library staff in the online environment? We talk a lot about digitizing collections. I got a lot of pushback about saying this, but to be provocative, I would say, how do we digitize librarians? There's immense knowledge and expertise invested in librarians and librarianship as a profession. How does that map into the digital context, particularly as we're at a point when we're talking more about social interaction online? On one hand, there's live chat, there's live reference, et cetera. We also started a different experiment, which was blogging. And blogging not just as a gee whiz, this is a trendy, shiny thing to do, but blogging as a way of externalizing knowledge in discrete chunks and putting it out in a way that could be discovered, crawled, aggregated, rolled into search results, and really worked into the experience of the catalog and nypl.org in general. So really is a way to create a voice for and expose staff online. Right now we've got about 50, this is the tag cloud of the most popular subject headings on these blog posts. As you'd expect, librarians really enjoy tagging and categorizing their posts. We've got about 50 librarians and curators drawn from across the library engaged in this. You know, you can see just a brief overview here. So Jessica was one of the first. Jessica started by writing about knitting and writing about, her first post was about silk mittens and about a new knitting stitch that she'd picked up from a book in the collections. She moved on to write about book art culture and talked about the Center for Book Arts and a couple of particular art books in the collection someone might want to look at. Moved on to talk about, excuse me, talk about quilting a bit, stamping, etc. She basically very quickly developed a sort of portfolio of interests, very much self-selected around the general area of handmade culture, craft culture, et cetera, and its representation in the collections of the New York Public Library. This was not her this was not in her job description, this was not in her official, this isn't why, she wasn't hired because she had that expertise. But when we gave her an opportunity, she very quickly started to develop a really strong engagement with this topic, which is something she was passionate about. As you'd expect, as she started to do this, she started to develop an audience that began to engage with her about not just the stuff she was writing, but suggesting other materials, suggesting other topics, and actually starting to engage in a real discussion. So we sort of just did this. We put this out there and started experimenting. For the first 9 months or so, this blog was out there. It wasn't linked off the homepage. It was very kind of viral, word of mouth. It's at nypl.org/blog if you're interested in looking. That's a sort of meta blog, and it can be sliced by author or by topic. And it's been up and running for about 1.5 years now. And it's actually going to feature much more prominently in a redesign of nypl.org that's about to go live in a couple months. So Jessica had started really building a voice and an audience online. Standard sort of, you know, Web 2.0 kind of story. One of the people who she connected with was a woman named Grace Bonney, who runs a site called Design Sponge. Design Sponge is a community of enthusiasts around design culture and craft culture. Roughly 100,000 people, I think, read Design Sponge a month. And so she got in touch with Jessica, said, hey, I think what you're doing is fantastic. I love the library. Could we do something together? So we had a meeting. We all stepped back and we sat around a table and brainstormed and thought about, hey, what could we do that, that could, get our peanut butter in her chocolate and her chocolate in our peanut butter and come up with something interesting. So what we did was we actually developed a web video series. We did a 4-part web video series called Design by the Book, which was very much inspired by the fact that we were all total reality TV junkies and thought, hey, there's this really interesting model of you take some talented people, you put them in a context, you have them make something. You get them inspired and you have them make something. So we thought, this is what we want people to do at the library. And Grace was thinking, hey, I want to be able to do really great stuff with neat material. So we did a 4-part web video series. Episode 1 introduced 5 artists, 5 New York City area artists that Grace selected from her community. There's a printmaker, a glassblower, a ceramicist. Episode 2 brought them into the library. They were met by Jessica, who both introduced them to materials in the collection that they were interested in, but also introduced them to other library staff as well. Episode 3, they went back and they made something. In episode 4, they unveiled it and talked about the process. The video was on Design Sponge, it was on nypl.org, and it was on YouTube. We also pushed it out to iTunes, a number of different distribution channels. So that's interesting. We thought we'd push the boundaries a little further and actually see how many of these people are willing to tangibly come into the library who are watching the video. All told, we figured there were probably about 20,000 people who watched the video series online. So we held an event. We actually did a launch party for the last video at the library, where the artists brought their artwork, unveiled them, where we actually had a reference desk of sorts, staffed by librarians, to talk with people who came and were interested. Turns out that by putting the word out 2 days before the event, just via Design Sponge and our own blog, we had about 400 people show up at the library, almost none of whom had been in that building before. Really great community, really great outreach. A lot of people have shown up at the library since because they were exposed to what the library had. There's a Flickr group a couple people started that were people who were inspired by that web series and were taking materials from the collections. I believe there are a couple Eastern European textile patterns that inspired someone to do new work. Somebody else took some materials and did, I forget the name of the process, but a photographic technique to prints of them. So, one example, one pilot project, and I want to just, for the last couple minutes, spin out a couple of themes that I think are really important and raise core issues we've got to think about. Obviously, intellectual property. There are others today who are going to speak with much more sophistication than I will about intellectual property. One point to make is, in the course of this project, in the course of blogging about the collections, in the course of everything else, we have a very explicit pressure to steer people towards public domain materials because of the perceived risk in working with, in exploring fair use of in-copyright materials, because as we turn towards increased licensing of collections, of contractual restrictions, it's very much a sort of chilling effect in practice. Two bigger points, though. One is about the changing role of the library as an institution and really as a platform. When the model of a librarian behind the desk, where you approach them and ask them questions, doesn't really hold in the online environment. Honestly, in the same way as the model of a library as a big stone building, a temple to knowledge that you have to enter and play by its rules, when we shifted from a world defined by scarcity of knowledge to one at least defined by the perceived ubiquity of knowledge, the library can't simply sit back on its haunches, or at least our lions can't, and wait for everyone to come to them. It requires a much more proactive engagement, and honestly, one that takes place largely on third-party platforms. We leave our building, physical or virtual, and we go out into the world and we engage, and library work happens out there. This one project involved YouTube, Flickr, iTunes, Design Sponge. I now have a standing bi-weekly meeting with our counsel's office because of the tangled thicket of different contracts we have to sign in order to be able to go out and do library work in the places where people already are. A second point, about the changing role of librarians themselves. So, Jessica, like a huge number of people who work at the New York Public Library, is fascinating. Incredible person to sit down and talk to. And up till now, the web presence of the library has had a voice that looks like this. And it's not just the web presence, it's the institutional presence. It's an institutional voice, it's not an idiosyncratic individual voice. And that doesn't really map into the online landscape either. One of the things we're really trying to do is free and open up the myriad diverse voices of our staff. Now, this is interesting because it winds up really, really complicating the professional identity of someone like Jessica Pigza, who is blending her personal passion with her work at the library, and there's not a complete overlap. She has a blog at the library, she has her own blog. There's not a one-to-one match of posts. Some posts are cross-posted, some simply are on her blog, some are simply on the library's blog. She has a Twitter feed. NYPL also has a Twitter feed. We pick up some of her tweets, some of them just, are for her audience. We haven't really dug into how the general public perceives her role and the role of others like this in this environment. It's worth noting that when you Google her name, her library blog is what shows up first, followed by her personal one. So in order to do this, we've had to develop proactive policies on public internet communication to really enable this kind of work. One point to note is we proactively said anyone who blogs at NYPL, obviously the product is the work product is the property of the library as work. So the library holds the rights, but we've automatically issued a non-commercial license to the bloggers to take their work and bring it out into the world. But there's a lot to learn, especially because over the next few years, we have 1,000, I can't say we have 1,000 Jessica Pigsas, but we have 1,000 professional librarians and curators at New York Public. And it's a real question of what does it look like at that kind of scale, the one example I talked about today. So I'm at time, so I'll say thank you. Just flip this over.
All right. Great. So Jogn Palfrey.
Blair, thank you so much. And Josh, what a great opening presentation. This is fun. I suspect everybody here now wants to meet Jessica and probably hire her for their libraries. I know I do. Blair and Jack and Laura and others, thank you so much for the chance to be here at this conference. As always, you host a wonderful gathering and quite a crowd you've assembled here. When Blair called me the other day to talk about what we were to say on this panel, it was pretty clear that he was steering me away from library-type topics. I realized that when I sat down, Anne was saying she's the token woman on the panel. I'm the token non-librarian, I think, or wannabe librarian, somebody posing as one. He kept saying, why don't you talk about your research, talk about your book, talk about Born Digital, not anything to do with libraries. I may thwart you and talk a little about libraries, but starting with research. So Josh started us off thinking about the role of the reference librarian and curators and others. And I wanted to back up one step and look at what the changing patterns are of usage of some of our patrons. And I work in a law library at Harvard Law School, and the patrons are obviously primarily our current faculty and students, and want to touch on those two categories, and then end by coming back to the notion of the collection, because I'm not sure we can talk about services without talking about what, in fact, is the base of knowledge from which we're working. So first off, I spent the last few years doing focus groups and interviews with kids, and the kids were ages about 13 to 22. Most were in the northeast of the US. We can talk about the methodology in another setting, but it was focus groups and then in-depth interviews with some. We did similar methods in Europe, in Bahrain, in the Gulf, and in East Asia to sort of get a grounding, but most of these are kids who will be familiar to you. And what we were interested in mostly was the information pattern and sort of technological usage of kids we were describing as digital natives. These are kids who meet three basic criteria. One is that they're born after about 1980. The second is they have access to the technology. So very importantly, recognizing that only about 1 billion people on the planet have access to these things out of the 6.6 billion or so, and maybe if you add cell phones, you get another 3 billion or so, but recognizing there are people who are on the other side of that divide. And the other is recognizing that many of the young people don't have the technical skills that Jessica has or that others have, and that they're even in rich places like this. There are kids who use technology in less sophisticated places. So I'm talking about the kids who have the access, were born at this point in history, and have good skills. Two sort of stories that came out of the research that I think speak to the role of libraries and Libraries 2.0. The first set of questions that we asked kids was about how they would go about coming up with information on a specific topic. So in the familiar way, we posed ourselves as, say, a high school teacher, asking them to do a report on a topic they knew little about. The two examples I used in US focus groups were the Spanish-American War, which everybody knew had happened but couldn't tell you it was in the late 19th century, and secondly, Lou Gehrig's disease, another example of something people knew roughly what it was, but not much more. So we said, what would you do? How would you start this research? Open-ended type of thing. And 100 out of 100 kids we talked to said they would find their way to one of these, some physical device. They would open it up or turn it on, and they would open a web browser. 100 out of 100, complete. Then they would look for Google. They would type in Google, always Google, never Yahoo, Ask Jeeves, nothing else, it was Google. And then almost 100% said they would type in Spanish-American War, enter, right? Or Lou Gehrig's disease, enter. This is the exact pattern that everybody we talked to followed. Then they would look at the search results, right? They would look at the 10 things that came. And again, almost 100% of the kids would look for the Wikipedia entry for Spanish-American War or Lou Gehrig's disease and then click on that, right? That's where they started. And again, we're talking about almost every single person we talked to, no matter where in the globe. It was only at that point that there was some variation in what they did. So this was where I think this participation gap, the difference in sophistication, kicked in. So on the one hand, you'd have some students who would simply say, oh, great, I'm done, right? They would use the cut and paste function and put it in their paper and turn it in. Presumably these children or young people didn't get good grades, but they were efficient, right, in this work. And if you press them about what Wikipedia was, they didn't have all that much knowledge about where it came from, or the participatory nature, whatever. On the other end of the spectrum were the kids who didn't believe it at all, the total skeptics. And their line was basically, one of my classmates was here 3 minutes ago. They introduced 2 false facts to screw me up on my paper, so I'm not going to believe this at all, right? That was the far other end. And of course, there were some kids, roughly speaking, in the middle. But it was plain that this was the process that they were following as an introduction, the first way to get into a topic. Then everybody described the process of scrolling down to the bottom of the page, looking for other sources, right? If it were something where they could get access to some other things, then they might start the process of triangulation and so forth. But that was really a very consistent mode of getting there. The other thing we asked them about their Wikipedia practices once they were on this page was, has anybody ever edited a Wikipedia entry? So let me just try in this audience. How many people have edited a Wikipedia entry? Good number, right? This is much higher percentage. So in our group, it was a couple people, 1 or 2 out of 100, say. The follow-on question was, have you ever edited a Wikipedia entry to make a substantive change? So how many people have made a substantive change on Wikipedia? Many, many fewer. That's maybe a third of the people who raised their hands before. And of our sample, none of the kids, 0 kids, had ever made a substantive edit in Wikipedia. So query as to where this delta falls. They were the OCD kids who changed semicolons to periods, right? They just couldn't stand to see this thing in an unfixed way. But the notion that we as internet scholars have that every kid is now going from being consumer of information to creator isn't there yet, right? It's not exactly that we're in this participatory culture or the one that Jack Balkin yet describes in terms of cultural democracy. We're headed there, but it's not the norm, even for the most sophisticated kids. Okay, anecdote 2 out of the research. We asked them a lot about how they got news and information of the sort of up-to-date sort. And this was intuitive too. We found nobody, basically, who bought the New York Times or the Yale Daily News or the Boston Globe or whatever it might be and opened it in the morning and had a cup of coffee and read it cover to cover. Nobody, basically, right? The same pattern was true, that they all basically got the information more or less by some form of grazing for it over the course of the day. So they would have one of these little devices in some fashion. They would get headlines. They would be online. They would be following what their friends were doing on Facebook or Twitter. They were getting the information through a very social process. That was step 1. Step 2 was that after grazing for the information, some of them were doing a deep dive. Some of them wanted to go to the blog, the design blog, for instance, on that topic. And then that was fewer of the students. And then lastly, the small group of them also wanted then to provide some feedback. They wanted to blog it themselves, reblog it, make a video about it, make a slideshow. So you had a declining number of people doing this. The vast majority were just getting the headline, just the snippet. Some would then dig into the richness of the analysis and so forth, and then some would participate in the Web 2.0 thing, but it's a subset. And I want to press this also in the library context, which is over the course of the last 9 months at the Harvard Law School Library, we've introduced a number of the things, and in fact, many predated me, like Meebo that Camilla Tubbs was talking about in here. And as we evaluate the web metrics, many, 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 many more people still come to the reference desk or talk to a librarian in person, then go to the Meebo chat box, right? It's a great entree. A few students do that, but it really is about then that next in-person meeting. So I think one of the very important things to note is we are in incredibly early days in even how our most sophisticated students are using these technologies. And we have to experiment in the Meebo kind of way and in the Facebook and the YouTube's kind of way. And we should absolutely be doing that at the margins. But we also need to be watching what's working, what's actually helping the teaching and learning process for our students. How are they really learning and where do they really need the help? This is a crucial thing for us to continue to focus group and talk to our students and to provide a key guide. Secondly, our faculty is sort of a similar story in a way that there's a split, I think, among our most sophisticated users. Many who are decrying, sad about the disappearance of the print books on the shelves and wondering about this transition we're making to a digital age, and others who are saying we're not going fast enough. Some who are saying the practice and the study of law is interdisciplinary, and where's the data? I want the data that I can crunch and put into my law review article. Some are saying it's an international field. Why are you so far ahead with US materials and so less far ahead with things in the stands, for instance, which is something that some people are studying. There's a real breadth, I think, in terms of the needs and what faculty are expecting. We did an experiment this fall with hiring an empiricist, a postdoc who spent half of her time in our library. She was so overwhelmed with demand from both faculty and students that it was clear we could have filled up 3 or 4 or 5 FTEs worth of support in our library for empirical research support, figuring out how to access data, how then to process it, and so forth. This is something, obviously, that even a few years ago wouldn't have been so clearly needed. So I got the 2-minute sign there, and Blair, I will try to keep to it. But I want to mention, in addition to our faculty and students and changing norms, it's important also to put in the frame of the same services discussion this notion of our collection. What is our collection? What is it meant to be, or where will it go? And I think one of the things we have to do as librarians is to do some vision here and define 5 or 10 years from now, what do we want that collection to look like? Where are we simply providing access? What are the materials that are just going to be shared, basically? I'm looking at Brewster and Carl Malenwood and others. There's a version of the law or whatever your field is that's literally going to be shared public domain material to which we're going to point. And our job is to provide access, sometimes licensed, sometimes unlicensed, I hope more unlicensed. The hacking of Pacer that Steve Schultz is talking about falls in this category. There's then the other end of the category, which is the unique materials that we have, the materials from Harold Koh's deanship or balkanization in Jack Balkin's case, where these are unique materials that we have in our special collections as well, where what we have to do is either render some of those available into this commons or find other ways to share them, digitize them, and so forth. And then, of course, there's the big mass in the middle, which is we're still going to buy monographs, right? People still want to read some books, and we need to figure out how are we collecting in a way that's collaborative? How do we collect in a way that we're sharing the responsibility of preserving this knowledge in these formats? But it's that picture of an ecosystem, I think, that we have yet to develop. I think we still have somewhat old-fashioned notions of who's collecting what. I know that at the Harvard Law Library, many people think we're collecting a lot more than we are. And in an era in which we're cutting our budget by 10%, that's cutting $1.4 million out of our budget. There are going to be many fewer things that we're buying in this coming year. And I think it's crucial that we all sort of understand what we're doing and what we're not doing and aim toward an access to knowledge style system, as the Yale ISP has been urging us to do. So just by way of a wrapper on these topics, I think Blair urged me to talk about library as services. What are the services we're going to be talking about? And I think what's crucial here is to recognize, to some extent, out of the literature in open source software, Eric Raymond urged us to think about the cathedral and the bazaar. This is a familiar thing to us as techies. And in a way, I think that's partly what's happening here too, which is, yes, we will still have, it's still a hybrid environment. There still will be cathedrals in the sense of, temples to knowledge, beautiful spaces like the library here. But there's also the bazaar. And I think increasingly our young people, and to some extent our faculty, are operating in the bazaar. I think we're very good at being the high priest in the temple or the high priest in the cathedral. I think we're much less good at being the guides in the bazaar who grab the students and walk you through the bazaar and help you against your worst instincts and help you to the really good stuff. And I think that's the crucial thing we have to figure out is, while we're transitioning from all cathedral to some combination of cathedral and bazaar, how do we do that guide thing and figure out that we know some students are doing bad things when they're learning. We know some faculty can't keep up with these resources. How do we bring everybody along and serve our teaching and our scholarship mission in the process? So thanks so much.
Okay, so now it's your turn. Please come and ask questions. This is what this is all about, involving you in the conversation. As you're thinking about how we're going to be dealing with more and more bizarre users in the library over the next decade, let me just go for with the first question. But there are microphones out here in the center. Please come and engage in the conversation. But my first question for John, while you're thinking about your own questions, is when we think about the Harvard Law Library, most of us think about its superb collections, that this is an institution that truly has some of the best law collections in the world. How do you imagine the Harvard Law Library 10 years from now? What's going to distinguish the Harvard Law Library and the way that its collections now distinguish it today?
So Blair, thank you. This is, of course, a hugely dangerous question. As the physicist Niels Bohr mentioned, its prediction is dangerous, especially about the future, and I think in this particular case I could get myself in a lot of trouble by answering this question wrong. It is the case, I should note, that as we're making these decisions about what to cut, it's not that much fun time to be a library director right now. We often ask, what is Yale doing? So we pick up the phone and call Fred and say, are you guys cutting this? And is that, or like, how much trouble are we going to get in when those reporters don't keep rolling in? But no, much more seriously, I think what is going to distinguish great collections is, multifaceted. So I think one is to say, again, what are the unique materials that we have in our historical and special collections? How are we making those accessible? So one way we're making them accessible is digitizing them, right? We have this great collection of materials on war crimes, the Nuremberg papers and so forth. We need to make those in digital form and make those into Brewster's Commons. I want to contribute to that to some extent. A second is the born digital materials that our faculty are coming up with today, right? So some version of that is an open access policy. We as a Harvard Law School faculty voted to commit to make all of our scholarship available on an open access basis. We're pushing our journals to do the same thing, which is the Duke approach to that and so forth. I think that's a crucial step. Another, we announced last week a fellowship in honor of Yale's Morris Cohen, which is to give money to young scholars who don't have research budgets to come travel to the Harvard Law School library to do it and so forth. So I think that's kind of one piece of it, and really is saying, what is it that we have that others don't, and how do we render that accessible? But I think there's also the piece that says, look, on a preservation basis, we as a publisher, Harvard University, and MIT in this case, ought to take on the preservation and the archiving role to some extent for the stuff that we create. But we can't take on the archiving and preservation role for everybody, for everything in all libraries. And I think this is where the rub is going to come in, which is stuff that's not in Brewster's archive. It's not something that we've got and are preserving. The stuff in the middle that Elsevier or others are publishing, commercial publishers, who's archiving and keeping that? And I think the trick right there is to say, we as the Harvard Law Library need to be non-exclusive about this. We need to be less competitive. We need to be better collaborators and say, we're going to do some part of it, but we're not going to be on the hook for buying everything. We're going to work with you, and we're going to work with you and figure it out, and we're going to create an ecosystem that's reliable both for access and preservation.
Actually, before the question, if I might seize the opportunity for a moment and respond to a point that was raised on Twitter that I'd like to clarify. There's a TR Bruce in the back of the room.
Bruce, LA.
Awesome. Tell me if I'm mentioning it or if I'm twisting the question, but you did raise the point about why I raised this success story if it seemed like the message was, hey, if we put stuff online, it brings people to the physical library. And that I want to make sure that that's not the point that I came across with. To me, I think it's important. We've had a lot of discussion of the move to digital and digital techniques. And what I want to try to do is start bringing into the conversation the fact that our users live in both physical and digital environments, and they modulate back and forth between them in very sophisticated ways. So to me, the reason that I brought up as the sort of the sort of apex of that project, the fact that we actually had 400 people come into the biggest room in the New York Public Library who hadn't been there before, is more an indicator of a community that was formed, of real engagement. When we talk about Web 2.0 sites, we often talk about the big collection-driven ones like YouTube or Flickr. We talk a lot about Facebook as a social thing. I don't think we talk quite enough about Meetup, which is another example of an incredibly influential site. We talk about online fundraising as lessons to be drawn from the Dean and the Obama campaigns, but that notion of actual mobilization of physical people doing physical things and engaging, particularly as, like you, we're orienting more towards focusing our resources on the rare and unique archival materials that we have, and bringing people into physical engagement with them where possible in addition to the digital side. I just wanted to kind of nuance my point a bit because I didn't want people to walk away thinking that, to me, the point is just getting people into the physical building.
It's clear to me that you're using your BlackBerry Twitter app because I couldn't get on Wi-Fi up here. I think they blocked the speakers from being online.
Yeah, it was the search.twitter.com.
Okay, great. So we have a question.
Sorry.
Please identify yourself and then ask your question.
Hi, yeah, I have a quick question for Josh. Hi. Sort of following up on that, in terms of the success stories that you've talked about, I'm wondering what kind of institutional challenges that you've had within NYPL, especially given the stature of that institution. Challenges both culturally within the institution and also now just because of budget issues. Is digital initiatives being reinforced because of budgetary concerns, or are they being diminished because of budgetary concerns? Thanks.
So on the latter point first, in terms of the impact of the current context on what we're trying to do, I joined the library just shy of 2 years ago as part of an already underway process to reorient and retool the New York Public Library for a world in which people interact with information increasingly differently. The library was built for the 20th century, and we're trying to figure out how do we reconfigure it for the 21st. Which meant more investment in digital information, more investment in digital engagement, et cetera. At the same time, when last September and October the sky fell, a separate and parallel trajectory of how do we simply close a monster budget gap hit us. And we're doing the best we can to kind of reconcile those two and make sure we don't abandon the first in the interests of the second. That's hard work and in process. I think the goal is to come out of the current economic climate positioned well to engage going forward and not have to be building from scratch, 2, 3, however many years from now when the economy comes back. On the institutional challenges point, one of the things I highlighted that I'll just emphasize, it's that tension between the individual voices of the staff and the public and the institutional voice of the New York Public Library. That's a real challenge, and there are very different perspectives. We don't have total consensus within the library right now. The best I can do is probe the edges, do pilots, come up with places where even for the very traditional voice of the institution folks, they can look at something like this and say, hey, there's value here, and maybe we can learn from it and scale appropriately.
Great. Another question.
I'm just wondering, question for Jogn Palfrey. What are some of the major hurdles that we need to be trying to overcome in the direction of the Duke model, open access to legal scholarship?
So there are lots and lots of hurdles. It's hard to know where to begin exactly. So there are clearly a series of institutional hurdles in terms of adoption on a local level. And then there are a series of institutional hurdles that are kind of more systemic of the intellectual property variety and so forth. So just describing the Harvard Law School experience, we took it to our faculty as a vote, and even before our student journals even were focused on this issue, we as a faculty forced the issue and said we wanted to do it. And we voted unanimously to make our own scholarship open access. The hurdle that we faced in that particular dynamic really was sort of an education one, and it's still ongoing. I got a call yesterday from a faculty member saying, oh my gosh, a year ago we voted for this thing. I know I think it's a good idea, but wait a minute, why did we do this? This is totally annoying. Why is it annoying? Because she has to now go and get a little addendum to fix the intellectual property clause in the journal agreement and so forth, which I think bridges that sort of institutional problem of people don't get it yet, they understand why we're doing it, like the public good aspect is clear, but then how do you actually implement it? How do you make it real? That's a big issue. And we now have an Office of Scholarly Communication with multiple FTEs trying to make it real. But I would say it's only a fraction of what we're publishing right now is actually going into the repository. So I think that's kind of the first one. I think the second one really is this broader issue of a cycle that's developed around publishing that we have to break, right? I mean, if you think about it from the perspective of a law school and follow ditto in the sciences and so forth, we pay the faculty, right, to create the work, or the fellows or whoever else. We then pay the journals to exist. We prop them up financially and help them print stuff. And then we, as the libraries, actually go ahead and buy that stuff. Not only do we buy it from the journals directly in print, we buy it back from Lexis and Westlaw and Hein Online and others. Now, we need some intermediaries. I'm not saying we need to get rid of publishers, but we have a cycle that's quite different than the model that I think we're getting to. And at each of those levels, we need to have some kind of change, right? The faculty have to reorient ourselves to participating in the Tom Bruce, Brewster, Kale kind of commons. The journals have to be on board with a different revenue stream for themselves. And then we as libraries have to rethink again our role as access providers and preservers of some information. And before we go all open access, we need to be darn sure that people are preserving what's being created too, right? So if we make it, this is the data route problem, we have to get to a stable open digital format and backwards compatibility and all these other things, as well as a commitment on the part of some of us to archive enough of it that we know that we'll have as good a system as before. So it's an entire conference could be done on the challenges of open access. But I think the best thing that could possibly happen is that more schools pick up either the faculty mandate or do it through libraries or do it through journals. But I think we have to stand up and say this is collective action, and we're turning this into a collective action opportunity, not a collective action problem.
There were 11 of us together from major law school libraries around the country that drafted that statement, and it came up in the context of a lot of us were announced that we were going to begin cutting our subscription to print journals, and so it was in order to preserve access to those journals. We thought this was a good aspirational kind of a document. I think in retrospect, maybe one of the mistakes was calling on journals to cease publishing in print. Maybe they could wait on that step, but to begin publishing in a digital open access format, it's one that we can count on being around in future years. So next question.
This is a question for Josh. Your comment was about trying to steer your users and patrons more towards public domain materials because, check my paraphrasing, you have concerns about the risks around fair use and copyright. Can you talk more about that?
Let's see. I mean, when you're actually on the ground trying to do some sort of quasi-guerrilla style outreach thing like what we did, where especially where there are a lot of concerns and tensions around the institutional voice versus individual things, and where you're at an institution that I like to say, turns like the Queen Mary, if you're trying to chart a different path. There's a lot of institutional conservatism, and there's been a huge amount of back and forth, even at the basic level of, okay, what's a safe video to put online? What kind of checks and gatekeeping do we have to make sure that something that the institution is comfortable putting something as simple as a video file online? So for the Design by the Book series, not only did we make sure that there were no camera shots of anything that was sort of under copyright, and we didn't steer the artists that way. We also got signed releases from everybody that are extremely comprehensive. And I'm not saying that we had to do this. I think the decision was we're pushing the envelope in a number of other places, so maybe this is, let's not bite this off too, because we actually want to get this done and not have the council's office, who are great and who I'm working with regularly and who serve a very important function, not have them bite our heads off about this piece as well. And that's really just the issue of, within an institution, the competing voices and competing agendas that help to define this kind of stuff just in practice.
Blair, can I respond just really briefly? I know this wasn't directed to me, but just as an intellectual property lawyer, I think it's crucial that we push the boundaries on fair use. So I actually think this is a use it or lose it kind of statute, and we have to figure that out and push it. Now, if there's any ship bigger than the Queen Mary, I would use that to invoke the image of Mothership Harvard, right? So is no doubt that this is, I get that this is hard. I am the council's office worst nightmare in this respect too. I understand I'm putting, things at risk by pushing it. But if we don't figure out what is fair use in this context by by people who are providing this for knowledge and in the kind of semiotic democracy, cultural democracy in Jack Balkin's terms way, shame on us for not pushing that and figuring it out.
And if I can just respond also, because I don't want to, it's interesting because normally I'm the to the barricades person in conversations, and I don't want to come across as not. But because because I am as well. And I do actually have, I think we need to have skin in the game in doing this very much. Let me just tell one 30 seconds, which was at that event that we had. It turned out that we did a Q&A with some of the artists. The first question was an artist from Brooklyn who wanted to know, wait, so if I go to the library, I can actually, use and incorporate some of the material in my artwork? And it turned out that it was an incredible teaching moment for 400 people to say, yes, absolutely, we want you to do that. That's how these collections continue to live and breathe and move on. And it turned out that actually the library was having a program 2 weeks later, which was on fair use for artists, which was, incredibly over-attended. So I think we absolutely are pushing that boundary. I just wanted to, we played it a little safe in this context because we were pushing other boundaries first.
Okay, great. So
Don't
now,
hit me.
end of questions. We're going to move on to the next.